Hey, it's Carly with LaunchCode. So we're in our last video in the series introducing view models and the benefits to our application. We spent the last couple of videos going over how view models allow us to add validation into our application. Now we're going to kind of pivot gears and explore a different aspect of how these view models add advantages or add different feature capabilities to our MVC application. So before we dive in, just to think about, well, let's open up our event class. So a user now can create an event object that contains a name, a description, and a contact email. To add another aspect of event creation here, we're going to add the ability for a user to define a type of event. So these are things like conferences, meetups, virtual panels, those sorts of things. So categorizing the types of events that are included in our application. We want to add that item as another property onto our event model, but we don't want it to be a string as these guys are. So we don't want the user to be able to type into an input box any type of event they want. We want that to be more statically typed, so to say. We want that to be more rigidly defined. And we can do that using an enum. So before we add that property into our event model class, we're going to create a new class called event type. And this will define what are acceptable event types, or what are the only event types. And this, instead of being of type class, is actually going to be an enum type, which is a relatively new data type for us. So creating our own enum type gives us the ability to set a specific set of values for what can be categorized as an event type. So like I said, we'll have things like a conference, meetup, workshop, and just like a social opportunity. So let's save that. So this is the simplest form of an enum that we can create, and without going too much into without going in too much depth into what an enum type entails, what we've defined here are the names of the items that are inside of event type. The names also implicitly have, by default, since we haven't declared them otherwise, they also implicitly have value types of integers that start with zero-based indexing, just like any other list. So the conference has an implicit value of 0, and going all the way down to social, which has an implicit value of 3, and those will come in handy as we move forward in implementing this new feature. So now that we have defined our own enum type called event type, we can go back into event model and add this new property. And it's going to be of type event type. So it's going to be one of those enum values. And we'll just call it, on the event, we'll just call it type. So to have a user create an event and select its type, we need to make some changes to that view model as well. So we do want the view model to also have a type property. Oops. If you haven't figured it out by now, event itself is a keyword in C#, so you have to be careful. I might not. There we go. I guess that's one reason why I couldn't tab my way to autocomplete that, it's because we need to import this guy. There we go. So we had to import our event type. So now this is really where our view model is going to start to diverge from the event itself. So we already know that the purpose of the view model is to allow us to create statically typed views. So everything that is inside of, everything that's inside of our view model, the properties that are in this view model correspond to some element within this add view. In the add view now, again, like we talked about, instead of having a user be able to create an event and create its type just by typing in an input box like they're able to do for these other properties, we want them to select one of those types from that event type that we just defined. We want them to select that from a drop-down list with predefined values. And so in order to create that drop-down list, we have to do something a bit differently from what we've done before. So back in the view model, we need to create another property, which will be the list of these available options. So we'll create a new property, and this is going to be a list of something called select list items. And we'll talk about that in a second. And we'll call it event types. We need to import a couple of things. So I don't think we've used the collection yet, so we'll probably have to import that. Yep. And then we also have to import this item. So select list item is a type that's available to us from the framework, and what this gives us is basically the ability to create some kind of enumerable class that corresponds to the items available in an HTML select list, and a select list is the element name for just a drop-down menu. So this structure requires that so a drop-down item is a select list that contains, I'm just going to use some comments for now, that contains option tags, and then those option tags have some value. So if, for example, if we want to select the conference type, we would view that conference text in the element. And then they also have some value associated with them. And then that value, the value really can be anything, but it's to our advantage to have that value be some integer based off of that zero indexed based off of that zero-based indexing that so many lists or collections rely on. So this is the HTML tag, or an example of the HTML tag that we want to have generated in our drop-down list, except we want not only this option tag, but we also want another one with a value of 1 and a text of meetup, I think is the next item in our enum. So we want to create a couple of these, and what select list item allows us to do is to define what goes in the text of this option tag as an item on its text property, and what goes in this value attribute as a item that goes in its value property. So we'll have to define those when we define this event types collection. So to do so, we can give this a value, meaning that this event types list isn't going to change across our application. It's always going to have the same value based off of our predefined enum type. So we'll say new list. Select list items, and we'll just define it right here. So we're going to, we're going to just pre-populate this off the get-go, and we'll populate it with items here. And in order to initiate a select list item, like I said, we need both a value and a value and a text value. So the first item in that list is a text value, and that first text value that we want is the enum.conference, and that's our first value. But the problem here is that event type.conference gives us that type that we've defined as conference. So we need to cast it to a string, because both the text and the value that select this item requires, both of those need to be of type string. So we have to say type string. And then, so this is the text. Now to define the value, we have to do something very similar but different. So we need to say event type dot conference to get to get that first item in our enum type, but to get to not just directly cast it to a string, but rather to get its implicit integer type, we'll cast it to an integer. But then, because this value attribute requires a string, we need to then take that cast and cast it to a string. And now we need to repeat this process for each item in the enum. I'm actually just going to copy it and change the names. And the last one is social. I think we probably need a semicolon down there. There we go. So each one of these lines from 26 to 29 is going to create a different option tag. The first argument in that select list item constructor is what defines the text that's going to be in that option tag, and the next argument in that special select list item constructor is what defines the value in the option tag. So now that we have that collection defined, we can remove this comment and actually implement this within the view. So we have this view model property event types in order to have our view aware of what event types are available. So back in our add form, we want to create a new input that is once again going to be one of these divs, and we'll give it a form group class like the others. Oops. And it'll need a label just like the other guys. And this is corresponding to event type. Oops. So that'll be type. But instead of creating an input element, we're going to create a select element, which will create that drop down. And it's for type again. And in order to populate this select element with its children, with the children option elements, we use another tag helper called ASP items. And items is populated by model.event types, that list that we just created. And we have to use model.event types here. We can't just call this event types. And actually, let's give this label. We'll call this event types. Okay, so now we've added the code that that is needed to add that drop-down item into our application. So if we ran the application, we would see that drop-down list in our add form. But now we need to wire it up so that the user's selection of what type of event they're creating makes it into the event property. And to do that, we want to go back into events controller, into this event creation, and we want to add that event type. Okay. Oh, it doesn't. Oh, I keep putting semicolons in this list, but we don't need them here. Okay, and so we can see, so we have that visual indication too, that when we create an event for ourselves in this testing phase, that we see that event's type in the details view. Let's go into our home page and add that as a column. Okay, and I think that's all that we need to see this in action. So let's start our application. Go to our home page and add an event. Oh, look at that. So we have a drop-down menu. Is it populated? Looks like it is. Before we create an event, let's go back into our dev tools and let's see what's happening under the hood. So see, we do have these the values on our option tags being created. So our select list item list did its job. So let's add strange loop. And that's of type conference. So let's make sure that our drop-down works. I haven't touched, well, maybe I've touched it, but I haven't explicitly selected anything, right? So let's make sure that it does indeed recognize that default selected value. Actually, we can close this for now. Okay, great. Well, I guess that's not great. That's another table styling item that we can improve on. So you see that the type didn't so you see that our table needs to have some styling rules around, I guess, an empty contact email. But our type is recognized. Let's make sure that we can recognize another type that isn't the default select. So what have we had before? We can do the Queer Tech Symposium. That's not a conference. I guess that type is a symposium, but we don't have that option, so we'll find something else. and we can see what will happen when we put in a contact email. Let's call this a meetup. So our contact email still isn't working. I'm not sure what's going on there. Let's check that out. Oh, I just don't have the, I wonder if I wrote over it and didn't notice that. Well, I just don't have the table data being generated for the events contact email. That is actually a really easy fix. Okay, let's stop and start it again. A little detour. Let's do one that's more of like a workshop. Let's say, I think that's a meetup. Meeting to and actually let's try this without a contact email and see if that the type still kind of migrates over now that we do have the space for that. And instead of calling it a conference, we'll call it a workshop. Okay, cool. So that's really all I need to see to confirm that that works. So my mistake for not including that before, our table styling seems to work just fine. And we can create new events using those predefined event types. So I just want to point out, now that we've seen this in action, I do think it's worth it to go back into the code base and point out what's happening with that drop-down list, because it is a little bit nuanced or can be confusing. I think the first time you encounter it, it took me a second to look at it. So our view model needs to know about the type of event that's being selected by the user, in addition to the types of events that are available to be selected by the user. But our event model does not. And I think that distinction, that distinction is important because it brings to light another sort of advantage that using view models gives us, which is that the view model is tightly coupled to the view itself, and it does have implications for how the data model, or the model that contributes to our data storage, how that model is created. It does have implications for that. But the view model is really present to help create the types present or available inside of the view.